Larry in Santa Monica, California. Hey, Larry, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how's it going?
Good. What's up?
Good. Yeah, so I just wanted to weigh in on the prosperity gospel. I was an African-American Baptist pastor for almost 17 years. And the prosperity gospel actually did quite a bit, in my view, to help the black community. You know, previous to World War II, 85 to 90% of blacks who lived in the South, two things they were told every Sunday was, A, don't worry about your social condition because you're going to go to heaven and everything's going to be all right.
Or the poor are blessed.
B, don't worry about your financial situation because when you die, God's going to give you a crown, a gold crown. You're going to walk on golden streets and all of these things.
Right, and this was also the message of the slaveholders, by the way.
Absolutely.
This is
and
how they use
segregation.
Christianity to keep people in spiritual chains.
Absolutely. And definitely pounded from the pulpit by segregationist preachers who happen to be the tutors of most of your black pastors in the South.
Right.
And so after World War II, when blacks began to migrate to the North and to the West, and opportunity began to open up for black people, and positions where black people could actually earn income became open, they were still going to church on Sunday and hearing, don't worry about it. You don't need to seek for wealth. You don't need to worry about getting money. Jesus loves the poor best. You know, after all, blessed are the poor in spirit,
right,
and all of that kind of stuff. And so when the prosperity gospel came along in the mid-'80s, and it really was ground zero out here in California with a pastor by the name of Reverend Frederick K.C. Price, who was the first black syndicated preacher, preaching this kind of a message, black people's eyes all over the community were wide open. We had never heard this message before. You mean it's okay to actually have wealth? It's okay to actually go out and seek for wealth? It was actually revolutionary. Now, there is a great debate, and I understand it and I get it, within evangelical Christianity and Christianity at large about the validity of the prosperity gospel, and I get that argument. Right. But I also have to say, again, as a former African-American preacher, it did wonders psychologically for black people. Quite frankly, I think it still is.
That's a fascinating perspective, Larry. So I'm looking at this thing through the lens of my own white male privilege. And, it's, in fact, there have been 2 times in my life where I've literally given away everything I own. I guess knowing that, hey, I'm a white guy in America, I can bounce back. That's a very different reality that I grew up in and that I experience on a day-to-day basis than most African Americans in this country. Or many.
Right. So when white people go to church or go to church on Sunday, or even, when the prosperity gospel first, launched in the 80s and got really popular in the mid-90s, when white people were going to church on Sunday, not all, but the majority of white people, they would probably hear that same message, don't seek after wealth, don't worry about it. But their day-to-day reality was that they were increasing financially. Their wealth was accumulating.
Well, I think it's that speaking as a lower middle class kid, my dad worked in a tool and die shop, and we lived in a what wasn't a poor neighborhood, but it wasn't even a middle class neighborhood. I mean, dad and mom and 4 boys. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. This is, so in white middle class, it was kind of the bottom of that. And I would submit to you that when white middle class people hear Jesus, hear it being preached that Jesus says being poor is okay, they are thinking of themselves as that poor. They're not realizing that there is, or they're not putting it in the context of, geez, there's huge, subclasses of people by virtue of race, by virtue of geography, by virtue of, whatever, circumstances of birth, who are profoundly poorer than I am. And
that may absolutely be the case, and maybe that's the reason why not only within the black community did the prosperity gospel take off, but also within white communities, because as we all know, there are plenty of lower middle class and poor whites, and so the popularity of the message did not only take place in one sector of Christianity. It really went across.
Right, but it's more often trashed by white folks than black folks, and I think it might.
Well, it's more often trashed by your fundamentalist evangelical Christians. And I think that needs to be made quite clear because, again, there's plenty of evangelicals that embrace wholeheartedly the prosperity gospel message, but it's the fundamentalists like Baptists, mainline Presbyterian, Methodist. And
where do you find
a church?
I'm sorry, forgive my interrupting you, Larry. Finish your thought.
Yeah, I was just going to say the reason why the fundamentalists push back is because they see that their churches, and again, I watched this for almost 20 years, from the position of a pastor. These fundamentalists literally were watching their pews, and still are watching their pews empty out to go down the street to the guy who has a more positive message, and is saying, "Hey, listen, you don't have to be poor. God does not want to see you struggling. God actually wants to see you living in not necessarily rich, but financial abundance." And so these fundamentalist guys are losing their members.
Yeah, and I think that middle ground, kind of a pseudo-prosperity gospel is what Robert Schiller was preaching for years. And he was the only one of the television preachers that I could stomach and who I actually enjoyed watching. And I told the story earlier of his coming to D.C. and just absolutely giving the religious broadcasters hell, throwing Jeremiah in their face. I gave you my sheep and you did, and you acted like ravening wolves. And but Schiller was not preaching get rich. Schiller was preaching have a good life and be a good person and help others.
That's right. He was on the less, if you want to call it radical, end of the spectrum when it came to a positive message. But even that message now, Joel Osteen may have picked up from there. I wouldn't consider him a prosperity gospel preacher, but he's definitely a preacher with a positive message.
What's the biblical basis? What's the biblical basis for the prosperity gospel, Larry?
Well, there's a verse over in the book of John, 3 John, I believe it is. That says, and there's so many verses. The one says, brethren, I wish that above all things that you prosper and be in good health. That's just one verse. And then there's other verses which Jesus says, I've come to give you life and life more abundantly. And then just other verses where Jesus says, I've come to make you whole. And when you do a research into that word whole, it doesn't necessarily mean physically only. It's speaking about your entire being, your body, your spirit, your soul.
Well, these are very different messages from become like Donald Trump.
These are very different messages. And see, the whole thing with Donald Trump and his ilk and the billionaires and the millionaires who appeal to evangelical Christians is, you have the pastor who preaches the prosperity message saying, you can have it, you can be financially supplied. You can live in abundance. But then the billionaires and millionaires come and they co-opt the message, and they say, "Well, hey, look at me. You can be like me." Well, but that's not what the pastor is saying from the pulpit. What he's saying is God does not want you to be poor. God is not interested in you living the life of a pauper. You are His child, and He is a God that has more than enough. And so, therefore, He wants to make sure you have more than enough. But it's not saying go out there and be Donald Trump or the Koch brothers.
I get it. Jono was over at the TV studio a week or so ago, and he had a fellow with him who was presumably a friend of his, who made the comment to me as they were leaving. He said, "I was born poor, and there's no sin in being born poor, but it's a sin to die poor." And I didn't rebut. This was what he said to me as in the context of, nice to meet you, see you later. He was walking out of the studio. And I thought, well, I don't think it's a sin to die poor. It's probably uncomfortable, but it's not, But is that one of the slogans of the prosperity gospel?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say the main banner of the prosperity gospel is to say that, hey, it's okay psychologically to open up to the idea that you can be blessed financially along with being called a child of God.
Along with being blessed spiritually.
The two are not mutually exclusive.
Sure.
But
this is sort of like capitalism. Capitalism in and of itself isn't inherently evil or destructive. But if the rules of capitalism, which are always written by governments have to create the currency and the rules for the playing, basically the playing field. If the government has been captured by the capitalists, then you have basically a cancerous system, a destructive system. So having regulated capitalism makes sense. Unregulated capitalism is a cancer. Similarly, saying, if you're going to be whole, including financially whole, that's a healthy thing. But if you're going to make riches the first priority of your life, now you've gone into the cancer stage of theology, as it were.
You've gone too far because you can't serve both God and, as King James Version says, mammon.
Right.
If you're well supplied, you're able to take care of your health. You can afford health insurance. You can afford good food. You can afford to live in an environment that's not toxic and going to kill you if you have the financial ability to do so. And also, you have the ability to fulfill Christian duty by helping other people, because the poor cannot help the poor.
Right.
Period.
By and large. I mean, there's always time, but sometimes there's not even time. A fascinating conversation. Larry, thank you for educating me.